Okay, so we're going to study the Hasidic discourse, and again, as is our custom, usually related to the Parsha. And we discussed yesterday, we tried to discuss, despite the challenges of the technology, we tried to discuss the laws of the opening Parsha, the opening mitzvah of the Parsha, which is a little bit strange, at least to modern ears. And we offered some of the interpretations, the classic interpretations. And today we're going to revisit that opening story of the Parsha and offer, hopefully, God willing, offer the Hasidic and Kabbalistic interpretation. And we'll try to be ambitious today and offer at least two general interpretations. And then we'll see how detailed we can get. So just as a quick reminder, we were referring to the mitzvah that Teitze when we go out to battle on the enemy. So there's a possibility that a person will see a woman of beautiful form, Eshet Yifat Tar, and the mitzvah is that you should bring her to your home, wait 30 days, and then you could marry her. If you don't want to marry her, then you have to let her go free, and you can't oppress her. You can't sell her. That's the mitzvah that we discussed yesterday, and the mitzvah that we read in the opening mitzvah of the portion of Teitze. Today we're going to discuss the Hasidic discourse, the Hasidic insight on this mitzvah, and there's at least two general ideas that appear in Lekutei, the discourses of Rabbi Shneur Zalman, the founder of Chabad, in this parsha. The first one really just talks about the concept of the first phrase, going out to war, and doesn't really get into the concept of what is the woman of beautiful form and how do you treat her, etc. That is left for the second discourse. So we'll start with the first, and then we'll go to the second. Hopefully we'll be able to get at least a taste of both. So you talk about battle. So one thing we understand that the Hasidic, the premise of the Hasidic philosophy is that everything in the Torah, even though it is true in the real world, it's true in the most common, in the basic interpretation through which we understand it, but there is a mystical interpretation that happens and plays out within the soul of every human being. So everything that the Torah tells us, it's not just that, in case you go to war and you find a beautiful woman, but everything has to be interpreted within the self. So within the self, there's a spiritual battle and a spiritual war, and all the laws of war and all the expressions that the Torah uses to describe this war, all of this applies within the spiritual soul, within the spiritual battle, which is the battle within the human soul. So this opens a whole new approach to biblical interpretation. In addition to the basic interpretation, in addition to the halachic interpretation, where we have to know what to do, but it's a whole nother interpretation that it applies within the human soul, and every detail has to be applied that way. One of the benefits of this interpretation is that we're not just discussing ancient law. In other words, there are many laws of the Torah that don't apply today for whatever reason, either because we don't have a temple or because the specific conditions don't apply. So there are many laws that don't apply today. I don't think Jews have not practiced this law of a beautiful woman of going to war and captive and being able to bring her to your home. A lot of these laws don't apply today. But so why are we discussing the Torah? So if you say the Torah just has a simple interpretation, then maybe it doesn't really apply today. Maybe we should learn another mitzvah. We should learn a mitzvah. There are many other mitzvahs in the Torah of this week that do apply. So why are we focusing on a mitzvah that doesn't apply? But if you look from the spiritual interpretation, then every mitzvah applies, because in addition to the simple, straightforward meaning, there is a spiritual meaning, and it is, in fact, applicable within the heart of every person. So that's the introduction. Friday morning, so I'll say a joke. I don't know how funny it is, but I'll try to say a joke. So we were 16, and we were learning Hasidic discourses, a book called Derech Mitzvaysecha. It's from Rabbi Menachem Mendel, the third Chabad Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek, and he wrote commentary on the mitzvahs. but the Kabbalistic commentary on the mitzvot. So we're 13 years old, and it was in the summer. Everybody at 7:30 in the morning. We would study half of the day and then play sports the other half of the day. So the teacher, Rabbi Wahlberg, is a great Talmudic scholar, a great Hasidic scholar, and he would teach us the Hasidic discourses. So it happens to be that we started the first two mitzvot that we studied was the mitzvah of a Jewish servant and a Jewish maidservant. And over there, the discourse explains how these mitzvot, even though they don't apply today, but the spiritual mitzvah, the spiritual meaning, it applies today. And then once we finished those two discourses, Rabbi Wahlberg said for a joke, he said, what mitzvah should we study now? So he said, well, we studied two mitzvot that don't apply today. So why don't we study a third mitzvah that doesn't apply today? What is that? The mitzvah to love your fellow as yourself. Of course, it's a joke because it applies today. He meant that it doesn't apply in as nobody keeps it, but it's certainly a mitzvah that applies, and also in a practical sense. But that's just a joke to tell you that the mitzvah, every mitzvah we read in the Torah, in addition to the practical interpretation, which may or may not be applicable today, there's the mystical interpretation where all of these concepts apply within the person. Okay, so let's start. Battle. What's a battle? So, a spiritual battle. What's a spiritual battle? So we know we have two souls, and we have the animal soul and the godly soul, and there's a battle. If you study Tanya, the book of the founding book of Chabad philosophy by Rabbi Shneur Zalman, the author of the discourses that we're discussing, and it depicts this all tension within life could really be boiled down to the battle between the animal soul and the godly soul, which is a nice way of saying the self-oriented part of self and the transcendent part of self. And every decision we have to make, and when we feel some tension, it's because there are two drives within ourselves, and we have to manage this battle. Okay, that's general. But we're going to get more specific. And specifically, there's a quote from the Zohar. The Zohar is one of the earliest works of the Kabbalah, attributed to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who lived in the 2nd century. And the Zohar has a phrase as follows. It says, Shat Slota Shat Krava. Time of prayer is a time of battle. Right? You think of coming to shul. Hopefully you pay a membership and you get a good seat and it's comfortable. And we know the trick of Chabad is we know that we don't put out comfortable seats, because if the seats are too comfortable, then people fall asleep during the rabbi's sermon. And so it's not supposed to be too comfortable. But sometimes you go to a nice shul, you pay up membership, you get a leather cut for seat, you sit down and you enjoy the show. The rabbi is going to entertain. If it's the high holidays, maybe you have a cantor, or maybe you have a choir. And it's like going to the opera. It's wonderful. That's how some people view the concept of prayer. But the Zohar says, no, prayer is not a time to sit down and relax and raise your legs and listen to the beautiful music and the beautiful sermon. Says the Zohar, the time of a prayer is a time of war, meaning it's a battlefield. It's a spiritual battlefield. Why is it a battlefield? Because that is where what we're trying to do is we're trying to allow the godly part of self, the transcendent part of self, to overcome the more animalistic and more self-oriented part of time of self. So even though the battle plays out many times throughout the day, but when do these two forces go head on within the person? That's within prayer, which is why we pray every day. You know, some people ask, it's very common to ask, why do we have to pray every day? You know, you wake up in the morning and you say, God, you're so great. And then we come in the afternoon and tomorrow and we say, God, you're so great. And you would think maybe God has a low self-esteem, so we have to remind him that he's so great, because if we don't remind him, he may forget. But from the spiritual perspective, so there are many reasons, many answers to that question. Typically, we understand that when we praise God, it's not for the benefit of God, it's for our benefit, that we can appreciate what God does for us. But in the context that we're discussing right over here, is because there is this, because we have opposing forces within ourselves. So every day we have to make sure we have to fortify the godly soul over the animal soul. And the time we do so is prayer. Because if you're in a battle, you never know when the enemy is going to attack. And you have to be prepared. And the preparation and the time of battle is the prayer. That is the background of what the Zohar is saying. And again, the idea of battle, it's not so militant or negative, but the concept is we have to face the reality that within ourselves we have two opposing drives. If you boil it down, part of us wants what's comfortable for the self. Part of us is self-oriented, and when you deal with that part, nobody else really matters. And you're only here, if you're in my life, you're only here to make me feel good. When part of us really and truly, really wants to transcend, wants to give to others, and will only be happy when it forgets about the self and it connects to others and it gives to others and it connects to something higher and to a transcendent God or a transcendent goal or transcendent purpose. And this is a real battle within the human soul, and we have to manage it. And now we're going to discuss how we manage it, at least one form within the concept of prayer. So let's go back to the verse. And again, all good Hasidic discourses begin with a grammatical problem within the verse. Ki Teitze la milchama, you will go to battle. Al oivecha. So it's translated, if you go to battle with your enemy. But if you read it literally, it's if you go to battle on your enemy, on top of your enemy. Okay, so what exactly does that mean? What does it mean to go on your enemy? So one interpretation, there's an interpretation that says that the only way you'll be victorious is if you, when you go to battle, if you realize that you are superior and therefore you have confidence in your ability to overcome the battle. If I come into battle and I am frightened and I think that I don't have the power to win, then I'm going to lose. The pessimism is going to be self-fulfilling. And therefore the only way to actually win a battle is you have to be a pawn, you have to be on top, you have to see yourself as superior in power to your enemy. So it's really a question of what the approach and what the attitude of the battle, what the attitude to battle should be. That's one interpretation. But now we're going to the Hasidic discourse takes a different approach, and it's a little bit more esoteric. But I'll put it out here, and then we'll try to develop it. So what the Hasidic discourse tells you is that we're battling the animal soul. You can't really battle the animal soul. You can't transform the animal soul. Okay, what's the battle? What do I need to do? I need to destroy the animal? No, I don't need to destroy the animal. In other words, there is a self-oriented drive within self. What are we supposed to do with that? Are we supposed to slaughter the animal? So some spiritual seekers seek to slaughter the animal, but Judaism does not seek to slaughter the animal. Judaism seeks to transform the animal. In other words, if you could orient your self-oriented drive and make it instead of a destructive force, make it a productive force, then in fact, that is actually the purpose of your creation, really, to transform the self-oriented drive and make it something, and direct it to a spiritual cause. Because there is we discussed this many times, there is an advantage to the self-oriented drive, and the fact is that because it's so animalistic, it's much more passionate. So if you think about it, the more spiritual desires that the godly soul has, in other words, the godly soul is not as passionate as the animal soul, right? You have some people who are very intellectual and they have very good ideas, but they don't have the passion to see it through. Then you have other people who are very emotional, and therefore their emotions sometimes are immature. But whatever they want completely. Like I like to say, if I want to study Talmud, okay, I may or may not do it. There may be an obstacle. If I want a piece of chocolate cake, nothing is going to stop in my way because that passion is so raw, it's so animalistic, it's so raw, it has much more force. Now, what's the purpose of the battle between my transcendent self and my animalistic self and my self-oriented self? It's not to destroy and slaughter the animalistic drive. It's to transform it. What do I mean to transform it? To explain to it that what's really good for you, what will really make you happy. In other words, it's almost selfish to be transcendent. It's almost selfish to help others. It's selfish to do something that will cause you not only instant pleasure, but longer term pleasure. And when you do that, what happens is now, when my godly soul wants to study Talmud, okay, the obstacle will disturb it. But if my animal soul wants to study Talmud, there'll be no obstacle. There'll be nothing stopping it, because that raw passion now has been transformed. Okay, how do you transform the world? So we discussed this concept many times in the discourses of Rabbi Shneur Zalman. We discussed it especially when it comes to the law of the red heifer, that you burn. I don't want to get into that, but that was the point. That's a common theme. But this discourse says, how do you do that? How do you tell the animal that you have to transform yourself, and instead of liking cotton candy and vanilla fudge ice cream, you have to like something that is a little bit more abstract and a little bit more spiritual and not tangible, so the animal really doesn't understand it. So you can't speak a logic to the animal because the animal is not listening. I don't really care about abstract ideas. I care about the animalistic self-oriented side of self. Cares about that which is tangible, not about that which is abstract. So that's the obstacle. It's a language obstacle. So what Rabbi Shneur Zalman is going to tell us, that what this verse is telling us, you can't speak to the animal. You have to really bypass the animal, and you have to speak to the source of the animal. You have to speak to the animal about its source. And then somehow or another, the animal, when you speak to it about its spiritual source, that language will resonate within the animal, and then the animal could be transformed. So what do I mean? What do I mean? So the question, of course, is, so I'm going to, of course, every answer, you got to go around the corner to get to the answer. It's very straightforward. So there's another question. A Jew always answers a question with another question. So there's another question. What's the other question? You open up the prayers, and the prayers are confusing because there's so many pages. But if you look at the structure of prayers, the prayer is fairly simple. You have the introductory sections, which we're not going to discuss. You have the Shema, which is almost, okay, you have the Amidah, where we stand before God, and we ask God for what we need. It's called the Amidah. During the week, it's 18 blessings. On Shabbat, it's 7 blessings. That's the essence of prayer. Before that, you have the Shema, and the Shema prayer, where we declare the unity of Hashem. And when we say, and we read the verse, we read the commandment, love the Lord your God, which is really the essence of the battle. Because the verse says, love the Lord your God with all your heart. And the sages say with all your heart means both with your godly soul and your animal soul, or the language of the sages, with your evil inclination and with your good inclination. In other words, by the time you read those verses in the Shema, love the Lord your God with all your heart, my heart has already been transformed. Not completely, but for today. Right? Today my animal wants to cleave to God. So the Shema, in some sense, is the victory over the. In other words, the battle has taken place by the time I already said the Shema. So I have the Shema. Now the Shema, there are blessings that the rabbis wrote to introduce the Shema. They call it the blessings before the Shema. So in the morning there are 2 blessings before the Shema, 1 blessing after the Shema. So the blessing after the Shema is to allow the Shema, the feeling that we achieve during the Shema, to endure. Right? Sometimes you have a feeling, the feeling but the feeling may be fleeting. I feel it for a moment. How am I going to make sure that feeling endures? So for that you have the blessing after the Shema, which begins with emet, it's true, v'yatziv, and it's established, v'nachon, it's correct, v'kayam, and it's enduring. And we say 15 expressions of how this concept, the feelings that we create during Shema, should last throughout the day. That's the blessing after the Shema. What's the blessing before the Shema? Well, there's really 2 blessings. The blessings before the Shema is the time where we meditate and we think about those concepts that will awaken the love to God within ourselves. Okay. What is the theme of the blessings before the Shema? So the blessing, the second blessing, in other words, the blessing immediately before the Shema, is we talk about God's compassion to us. God, the kindnesses God performed to our forefathers. And in general, we talk about how God took us out of Egypt. God brought us close to him. It's talking about God's unique relationship with the Jewish people, which is obviously very inspiring because, as King Solomon says, that one way that the human heart is like a mirror. If you show love to somebody else, genuine love, eventually that love will be reflected back because that's the nature of the human soul. So if we think about God's love to us, naturally, our heart will reciprocate and our heart will reflect that love back to God. So we understand why the second blessing, the blessing immediately that precedes the Shema, we understand the theme of that blessing. It's a beautiful blessing. There are nice songs composed from those words. Very beautiful blessing. Okay, that's straightforward. The problem comes when we talk about the first blessing of the Shema. In other words, the first blessing where we're trying to prepare and get us in the mood to be able to say the Shema and then say, love the Lord your God with all your heart, meaning at that point you already have not just your godly soul, not just your transcendent soul, but also the self-oriented soul already loves God. So what's the first blessing? What's the first blessing to prepare us for that? So here we have a blessing that covers all kinds of interesting themes. But the core of the blessing is we think about the songs of the angels. The climax of that blessing is to say, Kadosh, 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 holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. That's a verse directly from Isaiah. And Isaiah talks about, he sees a divine vision, he sees God, and he sees God surrounded by angels, and those angels make a declaration, and we plagiarize that declaration, and we use it in our prayers. And then we say that is the Srafim, that's one form of angels. Then there are other forms of angels. There's the Ifanim and Chayat HaKodesh. There's Srafim, Ifanim, Chayat HaKodesh. Srafim means that they literally, Saraf comes from the word burnt. They're burnt up, meaning they have a fiery passion to God. They say, holy, holy, holy. Then there's the Ifanim. Ifanim is the wheel of the chariot. Then there's the Chayat HaKodesh, the holy animals. These are all Kabbalistic metaphors, but they originate in the prophets, in the vision of Isaiah and the vision of Yecheskel, Ezekiel primarily. And there we have the different classification of angels and what each one says. And we, the human beings, are plagiarizing and taking the songs of the angels and incorporating it in our prayer. Okay, so I asked you a question. Why do we need to sing the songs of the angels? Why can't we hire a few writers and we'll create some few poets and writers together? King David was pretty good. He filled up, a lot of the early parts of the prayer we take from King David. So you get a few people, you compose a song. Why do you have to sing? Why do you have to plagiarize from the angels? That is the question that arises when you think about, we have to wake up in the morning and tell and say, God, you're so great. This is what the angels say about you. This is what the Srafim say about you, one form of angels. This is what the Ifanim say about you. This is what the Chayat HaKodesh say about you. That's irrelevant. What are the human being? What are you saying? Right? Imagine you come to your friend's birthday party and they ask you to say something and you say, my friend's such a great guy. Your uncle thinks that about him, and Beryl thinks that about him, and Shmerel thinks something else about him. But what do you think, right? So here we're listing all the great songs that the angels wrote. Very nice. What do the human beings say? This is a prayer for the humans. So why are the human beings plagiarizing from the angels? That is the question that this discourse addresses. It doesn't phrase it exactly in this way, but that's the question that arises. You could say the angels are better songwriters. Maybe that's the answer. So the discourse, the answer of Rabbi Shneur Zalman is as follows. Everything in this world has a spiritual source. Every phenomenon in this world has a spiritual source. And one way, the problem is that sometimes when something is negative in this world, when you have a negative phenomenon in this world, it's not that it doesn't have a holy spiritual source. Everything in this world comes from God. Everything in this world comes from holiness. So how do you have things in this world that are unholy? How do you have things that are destructive? How do you have things that are negative? Do they don't have a source in holiness? The answer is they do have a source in holiness. The problem is that there's a certain disconnect between the source of this phenomenon and the phenomenon. In other words, I'm somehow disconnected from my source. And the way to correct me, and the way to heal me, and the way to make my existence wholesome again is not by destroying me, it's by elevating me to my source, because my source is holy. So if you think about this in this way, every phenomenon is good. There isn't a quality or an experience per se that's bad. If it's bad, is it because it was disconnected from its source? How do you correct it? You bring it back to its source. So give me something that's negative. Whatever it is, negative love. Negative love comes from positive love. Okay, there's a disconnect between the source of the positive love and the expression of the negative love. So the point is not to destroy love. The point is to help the person or to help myself experience love in a wholesome and proper environment, or in a wholesome and proper way, in a holy way. And in that sense, now I'm healing the love. How do I heal it? By connecting it to its source. And every quality, every phenomenon in this world has a holy source, and it's to the extent that it's negative in this world, it's because it's been disconnected, or it's been, if you want a metaphor from technology, so there's some bug. In other words, the energy has been rearranged in the wrong way, and therefore it cannot communicate with its source, right? They send the rover to Mars. After a while, there's something wrong, and the rover cannot pick up the signals from its source. And if so, it's just going to go crazy. And that's what happens sometimes. Sometimes the physical phenomenon in this world is negative, not because it doesn't have a spiritual source beaming at it and telling it what to do and giving it life and bringing it into existence. That too, that does have that. What it doesn't have the tools to understand and decipher what it's feeling, because it's sort of disconnected from its source. It cannot understand what the source is telling it. So what's connection? How do you connect? How do you correct anything in this world? You correct it by connecting it back to its source. Okay, that's a general Hasidic idea. We could talk about this all day. It's fascinating because in this sense, nothing is really negative in this world. It is negative, but in a sense, nothing originates. All the negativity originates from God. So the negativity is really just a expression of the positive that was rearranged, and you therefore could connect it by reconnecting it to its source. Okay, how does this help us? So let's think about the animal. Let's think about the negative, self-oriented passion that exists within ourselves. Where does this come from? Where does this phenomenon come from? How come people, present company excluded, except for me, but people have often drives that are so destructive, and they know that it's destructive, and yet they engage in these behaviors because the passion is so powerful. This negative passion is so powerful. It allows us to throw all the judgment out the window and do things that we know we're going to regret in about 5 seconds. So why do we do it? Or really, not why. Where does this phenomenon come from that we do things even though there's no reason to do it and there's a reason not to do it? So there's an intense passion. But so we just explained that every phenomenon in this earth has a spiritual source. So what's the spiritual source of this intense passion? So the answer is, the source is the angels. In other words, what are the angels? The angels are spiritual beings living in a spiritual plane who have an intense passion to God. Right? So where does intense passion come from? We are human. Our intellectual passions are not that powerful. Right? Our destructive passions are animalistic. But the human side, the holy side within ourselves is like the human being. The human being is intellectual, is not that passionate. In other words, the passion comes from the animalistic side of self. So what we're saying here is that the source of the negative passion within the person, the source of that is a holy and pure and intense and potent passion that the angels experience to God. And if you knock on the angel's door and you say, do you love God for a reason? He says, I don't need a reason. I don't need a reason to love God. The human being has to meditate, has to think about the greatness of God, and that meditation hopefully will trigger a love. But the angel, because the angel is also an animal, right? But if you look at the vision of Isaiah, of Yecheskel, you see that there's the divine chariot. Chariot is the metaphor for the angels who carry the mission of God. And if you read Isaiah, you see that the wheels of the chariots have the face of an animal. There's an ox, there's a lion, and there's an eagle, and there's the face of a human, but there's 3 animals. And when Isaiah refers to, when Ezekiel refers to the angels, he refers to them as the holy animals. Why animals? Why animals? Because just like the animal's passion is much more intense than the human passion, so too the angels' love to God and the angel's passion to God is much more powerful than the human. So the human really doesn't really understand the angel, because the angel, you knock on the angel and you knock on his door and you say, why do you love God so much? He's not going to say, because I went to a class and I meditated and we had a meditation weekend and we were able to think about the greatness of God and convince ourselves how wonderful it is intellectually to understand and connect to godliness. That's not what the angel experiences. The angel does not need an intellectual reason, because the angel has an intense passion to connect to God. Okay, now that intense passion is the source of the animal passion that we experience in our animal soul. But again, the animal soul is disconnected from its source. If you remember on Sunday, we discussed the concept that Adam named the animals. Discussed this Sunday. And we said, what was the big deal? Adam named the animals. The Medrash says that the angels could not name the animals. Adam could name the animals. So we said that naming the animals represents, the name is the spiritual source. And if you have to be able to see the animal and see how this animal's spiritual source is in heaven. The angels don't see that because even though they see the source, but they don't see how the creation down here is connected to that source. They see the separation. So they look at the source of the lion. They don't see within the lion down here. They don't see how the lion down here is an expression of the source is a vessel to the spiritual source of the lion. This is very similar to what we're talking about. Isaiah refers to the angels as animals, holy animals. What does a holy animal mean? They're not necessarily primarily intellectual beings because their love to God is super rational. Their love to God is much more powerful than a love that's produced by meditation. Now, so why do we call them animals? Because they're the source of the animals down here. What's the animal down here? Animal down here means, at least some animals, they're wild animals, they're animals of prey. That means an intensity that the human being does not possess. Now, the angels would not be able to see how the animal soul within us is an expression of their pure love to God, because their pure love to God is pure and holy. And our expression of our animal soul is sometimes very destructive. So they don't recognize themselves in our animal soul. Adam, the human being, has the ability to recognize himself, to recognize the spiritual source within the animal down here. So when I look at the negative passion within myself, the destructive passion within myself, I don't tell myself this is bad, this is evil. I say, you know what this is? This is the raw material that comes, that descends here, that descends into my soul from the animals who have an unbridled passion to God. Now, it's not expressed in the proper way, so I have to figure out how to correct it, how to align it with its source. But what am I dealing with? I'm dealing with an expression of that same passion that those angels have. Now we're going to come full circle. We're going to come full circle. So why do we plagiarize the prayers from the angels? When we say Shema Yisrael, Hear O Israel, and we think about the fact that Hashem Echad, God is one, and the entire universe is the oneness of God, and that's supposed to trigger feelings of love to God because we realize how God is all-encompassing. So that who are we talking to? We're talking to the human being within self. We're talking to the godly soul. We're talking to the intellectual side of self. But when we pray, we're not just praying with part of ourselves, with our godly soul. We're praying to the full totality of self, the animal soul included. So if you want to get the animal soul on board, you can't tell the animal soul, here, I have a meditation. Why don't you go buy a book and meditate and read? The animal's not listening. So what do you tell the animal? You have to speak to the animal in its own language. What's its own language? You have to speak to it about its spiritual source. And if you speak to it about its spiritual source, that language will resonate. So what do we tell the animal? You say, look, I don't understand you, but I want you to know that you know what the holy animals say? You know what the Srafim say? You know what the Ophanim say? Do you know that in the spiritual world there's an immensely intense passion that cannot be limited by the mind? It's super rational. And that passion is directed to God? You're talking to it a language it understands. So if you want to sing to your animal the song of the angels, because if you sing to your animal human poetry, your animal is not going to respond to human poetry. It would only respond to animalistic poetry. Okay, so we're talking about the animalistic as in the angels, but now talk to it about an intense passion that we can't really experience, the intellectual side of self. So we evoke it from the angels and we say, your source, understand that what you're feeling and what you're expressing is very different because you're feeling a deep desire for something, but you're expressing it in the wrong way. And therefore it's never going to be satisfying and fulfilling. If you want it to be satisfying and fulfilling, if you want to understand the urge within yourself, understand where this urge comes from and connect it to its source, realize that the passion you're experiencing for negativity originates in the passion to God and therefore will only be healed and will only be satisfying if you connect it to the passion that the angels have. That's why we speak first to the animals in the two blessings. So if you think about it, in the two blessings that precede the Shema, that we're supposed to awaken in order that when we finally say the Shema, we will experience the V'ahavta, the mitzvah to love God, with all your heart, with the totality of self. So if you look at those two blessings, blessing number one, we're talking to the animal soul. Blessing number two, and the first sentence of the Shema, we're talking to the godly soul. And therefore, we have to plagiarize from the angels because our animal only understands that deep, that intense passion that only the angels have. We ourselves cannot experience that. We can't speak on those terms. Okay. Now we come full circle. Says the verse, going back to the opening phrase of the parsha, Ki Teitze la milchama, you're going out to battle. What's the battle? So we already said, the Zohar said, battle, time of battle is the time of prayer. So you're going out to pray. You're going out to pray against your enemy. You're going out to pray you're going out to the battle against your enemies. So what does it mean that you're going out to pray against your enemies? You're going to pray with the animal soul, because the animal soul in its current expression is the animal soul. Its current expression is negative, and it's really self-destructive. And if you follow it, you're not going to end up in a good place. So you have to go to battle, not with the core of the animal soul, but with the expression of the animal soul. How do you do that? You can't go face to face. You can't start having a conversation with your animal, because your animal it will run you over. It's like an ox charging. It's like a bull charging. It's going to knock you over. The only way you can get to the animal is don't speak to it. Speak to its source. That's aloivecha, upon your enemy. If you go out to battle, aloivecha, upon your enemy. Upon your enemy means don't speak to it. Speak to its source. Evoke the song of the angels, because the song of the angels is really the source of what creates that passion within the animalistic soul. And the animalistic soul, those words of the source of the soul, the source of the angels, the source of the passion of the animal soul, will resonate within the animal soul. And now we read the verse. Now the verse fits. If you want to go out to battle, go on top of your enemies. Go on top. Go to their source. Reconnect them to the source. But you can't have a human conversation with an animal. It's never going to work. Last night, at 4 o'clock in the morning, I had a conversation with my son. He's just about 1 year old. I said, look, there's no rational reason for you to be awake right now. It's not making me happy. It's not making you happy. It's not going to do good for either of us. And I tried this avenue, that avenue, and I'm sorry to report. And after about an hour or two of conversation, he still wasn't convinced. You can't start talking to somebody who doesn't understand your language. So you can't start talking to your animal soul directly, face-to-face conversation. But you have to really get into its source. What's really happening? What's happening in the subconscious? The subconscious, the animal soul has a deep yearning for something, for what it doesn't know. So it wants ice cream because it thinks the ice cream is going to help it. So it wants other destructive passions because it thinks that's what's going to help it. It doesn't realize what that passion is. Our job is to say, Alevecha, find the source of your enemy. If you find the source of your enemy, that is when you'll be able to connect, to reconnect and to heal. Now we have about 4 minutes left. We're not going to have time to address the rest of the verse, but I'm just going to give you just a sentence or two because I promised to do so. And you don't want to go home and have a disappointing Shabbos because you only heard the first part of the verse and you didn't hear the rest of the story. So in short, going to war with your enemy, and you're bringing back the captive. Who's the captive? So yesterday you heard the captive is the Gentile woman. That's true on the simple level. But on the spiritual level, the captive is the soul. The soul, the holy soul, the godly soul is in captivity within myself. What is captivity? What's wrong with captivity? Captivity is a wonderful place. They feed you. They give you what you need. You have a roof. You don't have to pay the mortgage. You get 3 meals a day. And it's amachaya. It's wonderful, like you say in Yiddish. It's amachaya. The problem with captivity is that you can't express yourself. You can't do what you want. You can't go where you want. You can't express what you want. You can't say what you want. So you're being oppressed. The oppressed means it's the opposite of self-expression. So captivity is when you don't have the ability to self-express. Now the problem with the soul is that the soul and the body, the animal soul and the godly soul, share the same body. So if my godly soul wants to go to the study hall, and my animal soul wants to go to the ice cream store, and I go to the ice cream store, then my animal soul my godly soul is in captivity, meaning it cannot express itself. It cannot express itself. It cannot experience self-expression, and that's tremendously painful. And every time I do a mitzvah, what I'm really doing, the reason why a mitzvah gives me so much pleasure, and I know not always when you do the mitzvah do you get some pleasure, but you do because as you think about it, you never go home and say, oh, I did a mitzvah. Oh, I shouldn't have done it. I feel so bad. You never get guilt when you do a mitzvah. Sometimes you do something that you shouldn't have done. It's destructive. You almost always go home and you say, you know what, I shouldn't have done it. You always regret it. But you'll never regret a good deed. Why not? Because it causes internal pleasure. Why does it cause internal pleasure? What's really happening? What's really happening here is part of your soul, part of your psyche, part of your essence is being oppressed. It cannot express itself. And finally, when you do a good deed, you're doing what the soul wants. You're allowing it to express itself. And when you allow it to express itself, it's like oxygen. It's allowing it, it's giving it air, and that's a tremendous amount of pleasure. So when you say you have to go, and you have to go to war, and you have to capture, literally it says, not capture its people, you will capture its captive. Right? The grammar is a little bit of a problem. Why does it say capture its captive? You go to the simple interpretation of the verse. You go to battle with your enemy, and you will capture its women, its people, its friends, whatever the case is, its soldiers. It says, V'shavita shivyo. You will capture its captivity. It almost sounds like you're capturing the captivity that it captured from you, right? You're going and you're releasing that which the enemy had captured from you. You're capturing its captives. So you're taking back what it took from you. Oh, if that's the reading, then the captivity, the woman who now is in captivity is the godly soul. And we go to war, we allow it to express itself. That is that's releasing of the animal soul, of the godly soul. And then there's a process of healing, and you have to, and it cries, it warns for the time that it was in captivity. And we know that the Arizal says that it says you cry for 30 days. Why 30 days? Says the Arizal, that 30 days actually is a metaphor for the 30 days of the month of Elul, the month we are in right now, preparation for the high holidays. Preparation for the high holidays is a month a year where we're supposed to look back, even though in general we look forward. We discussed that yesterday. Forget about that. In general, we don't look back, but we look back to learn from the experience, not to mourn the experience, but to learn from the experience. And that's the 30-day period where the woman of captivity, will, in other words, the woman who was captive, our soul, where we learn from our past experiences, and then you could marry her. Marry is a deep form of unity. You become united with the perspective of the godly soul. So that is another full discourse. We only discussed it for 4 minutes. But again, now you can use your imagination and realize that everything is flipped, because from the spiritual interpretation, the captive is not the Gentile woman coming to Judaism. It's the godly soul that was taken captive because of the animal soul taking control over the body. And therefore, it was in a captivity in the sense that it could not express itself. And now allowing your godly soul self-expression is taking back the captivity, is releasing the captivity. So in short, what are we saying? In short, we're saying that when we pray every morning, when we want to awaken the love to God, in other words, when we want to heal the destructive passion within ourselves, how do you do that? Understand what is the source of this destructive passion. The source is the powerful, unbridled, yearning desire to cleave to God that the angels experience. So who speaks this language? The angels and the animal soul. We, the human being, the godly soul, doesn't speak this language because we're more intellectual. We're not that passionate. So we don't know how to deal with the animal. The way to deal with the animal is show it that its passion is positive, it's good, it stems from a spiritual source, and you reconnect it to its spiritual source. That's where it will find healing and it will find joy. This, ladies and gentlemen, is a story in short. If anybody wants to stay on and ask a question or lodge a complaint or agree or disagree or anything you'd like to do, please do so. Otherwise, have a wonderful Shabbos, and God willing, we will meet each other soon, both online and in person, in good health. Shabbat Shalom.